The hotel stood at the edge of the beach, isolated and ominous. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows, the building seemed to breathe, exhaling the salty sea air. The wind carried with it the distant sound of crashing waves, but something else lingered in the air, a feeling of unease that clung to the skin. The guests, weary from their travels, stepped inside, welcomed by the cool, damp air of the lobby. The receptionist's smile didn't reach her eyes, and the keys jingled ominously as they were handed over. There was a sense that the hotel had been waiting for them, like it had known they were coming. The guests brushed off their discomfort, attributing it to fatigue, and made their way to their rooms, unaware of the eyes watching them from the shadows. The night settled in thick and heavy, wrapping the hotel in a cloak of darkness. The corridors, once merely old and musty, now felt like a maze designed to disorient. The ocean roared outside, but within the walls, the silence was oppressive. One of the guests, unable to sleep, wandered the halls, footsteps echoing in the emptiness. As they passed by a mirror, their reflection lagged a second too long, a shadow behind them that wasn't there when they turned around. Lights flickered, and the air grew colder, like a breath against the back of the neck. The guest hurried back to their room, heart pounding, but the feeling of being followed lingered long after the door was shut. Morning came, but the sun brought little warmth or comfort. The beach, once inviting, now seemed to stretch endlessly into the fog. One of the guests decided to take a walk along the shore, hoping the fresh air would clear their mind. As they walked, they noticed a set of footprints leading from the hotel to the water's edge. But there were no prints leading back. Curiosity turned to dread as they followed the trail, the footprints disappearing into the ocean as if someone had simply walked into the waves and never returned. The water lapped at the shore, cold and indifferent, as the guest hurried back, suddenly aware of how alone they were. The hotel was large, too large for the few guests that were staying there. On a whim, one of the guests decided to explore, wondering just how many rooms were occupied. As they ventured deeper into the hotel, they noticed that most of the doors were closed, but when they tried the handles, they opened easily. Inside each room was the same. A neatly made bed, empty, waiting. Yet, something was off. The air felt raw and heavy, and each room had a strange, lingering smell, like something that had been left to rot. In one room, the guest found a suitcase, open and packed, but no one was inside. It was as if the occupant had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. The guest quickly shut the door, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the hotel grew more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, and faint whispers could be heard just beyond the edge of hearing. At first, the guests dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps the old building settling. But the whispers grew louder, forming words that made no sense, yet filled them with dread. They came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing down the corridors, slipping through the cracks in the walls. One guest pressed their ear to the wall, straining to make out the words, only to hear a voice whisper their name, soft and intimate, as if it were just behind them. They spun around, but the corridor was empty, the shadows deepening as the whispers faded into silence. The second night at the hotel brought a strange phenomenon. The sun set too early, plunging the beach and the hotel into darkness before its time. The guests gathered in the lobby, uneasy and confused, but the staff was nowhere to be found. Outside, the ocean was a black void, the waves invisible but audible, crashing against the shore with a fury that shook the windows. The darkness outside was impenetrable, as if the night had swallowed the world whole. One guest tried to leave, to find help or at least some answers, but when they stepped outside, the night was so thick it was like walking into a solid wall. They stumbled back inside, breathless and terrified, realizing they were trapped, the night stretching endlessly before them. As the night dragged on, one of the guests heard a knock at their door. Expecting one of the others, they opened it, only to find no one there. A chill ran down their spine, but before they could close the door, a figure appeared at the end of the hall. It was shrouded in darkness, its features obscured, but it was moving towards them with slow, deliberate steps. The guest slammed the door shut, heart racing, and locked it tight. But the knocking resumed, louder this time, and with it came a voice, low and insistent, demanding to be let in. The guest backed away from the door, but the knocking continued, relentless, as if the hotel itself was trying to let something in. By the third day, reality began to blur. The guests found themselves forgetting simple things: what time it was, what day it was, even why they had come to the hotel in the first place. Their memories became unreliable, shifting like the tides outside, leaving them disoriented and afraid. One guest stumbled upon a photograph in their room, a picture of a group of people standing in front of the hotel. But as they looked closer, they realized the faces in the photograph were their own, but distorted, twisted with fear. The hotel was playing tricks on their minds, dredging up memories that didn't belong to them, memories of people who had been there before, people who had never left. The fourth night came without warning, and with it, a terrible realization: the night was not ending. The clocks in the hotel had stopped, and the sun had failed to rise. Time itself seemed to have halted, trapping the guests in an eternal night. Panic set in as they tried to find a way out, but every door led back to the hotel. Every window showed the same impenetrable darkness outside. The whispers in the walls grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. The guests began to turn on each other, suspicion and fear driving them to the brink of madness. The hotel had them now, caught in its web, with no escape in sight. In the end, there was only one guest left, alone in the hotel that had devoured the others. The corridors were silent now, the whispers gone, but the air was thick with a sense of finality. The guest wandered the halls, calling out for anyone, but only their echo answered. The hotel felt different now, almost satisfied, as if it had gotten what it wanted. The guest stumbled upon the lobby, where the receptionist still stood, smiling that same empty smile. The guest tried to leave, but the doors wouldn't open, and the windows showed only darkness. With a sinking heart, the guest realized the truth. They had become part of the hotel, just another shadow among many, waiting for the next group of travelers to arrive. The hotel loomed against the stormy sky, its silhouette stark and uninviting. As the first guests arrived, the wind howled through the cracks in the old building, carrying the scent of salt and decay. The lobby was dimly lit, with shadows pooling in every corner. The receptionist's voice was barely audible over the storm outside, as she handed out room keys with a practiced mechanical smile. Lightning flashed through the windows, briefly illuminating the dark corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. There was an uneasy feeling in the air, as if the hotel itself was watching, waiting. The guests hurried to their rooms, eager to escape the storm, unaware of the true danger that lay within. One guest entered their assigned room, only to find it strangely dark, even though it should have been facing the ocean. The windows were covered in thick curtains that refused to open, no matter how hard they pulled. Frustration turned to unease as they noticed a chill in the air, colder than the storm outside. The furniture was outdated, covered in a thin layer of dust, as if the room hadn't been used in years. When they tried to call the front desk, the phone crackled with static, then went dead. Lying in bed, they could hear the ocean's roar, but it sounded distant, muffled, as if it was coming from somewhere far below. Sleep was impossible, with the strange sense that something was moving just outside the window, hidden by the heavy drapes. The corridors of the hotel were unnervingly quiet, the only sound being the faint echo of footsteps that didn't belong to any of the guests. One guest, unable to shake the feeling of being followed, ventured into the hallway late at night. The walls seemed to close in as they walked, the dim lights flickering above. With every step, the echoes grew louder, until it was impossible to tell if they were alone or if someone or something was following them. They turned a corner, only to be met with an empty hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly. The echoes suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Heart pounding, the guest hurried back to their room, but the feeling of being watched never left. Morning arrived, but not everyone who checked in the night before was accounted for. The hotel staff seemed unconcerned, insisting that the missing guest had checked out early. But the remaining guests felt something was wrong. One of them swore they heard someone calling for help in the middle of the night, a voice that was abruptly cut off. When they checked the missing guest's room, it was empty, the bed untouched, yet there was an overwhelming sense of presence, as if someone was still there. The guest's belongings were gone, but a single wet footprint remained on the floor, leading to the door. No one could explain it, but a deep unease settled over the hotel as the storm outside continued to rage. Exploring the hotel out of restless curiosity, a guest discovered a door at the end of a hallway that refused to open. It was old and weathered, with a rusty lock that didn't match the rest of the building's decor. Something about the door felt wrong, as if it was never meant to be opened. The guest asked the staff about it, but they dismissed the door as simply an old storage closet. Despite the warning, the guest couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind it, something that was better left undisturbed. Later that night, they heard scratching sounds coming from the door, faint but unmistakable, as if something was trying to get out. Fear gripped them, and they hurried back to their room, but the sound haunted them until dawn. As the evening fell, the lights throughout the hotel began to flicker, plunging the corridors into brief moments of darkness. The guests huddled in their rooms, but the flickering persisted, creating an unsettling atmosphere. Each time the lights dimmed, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, as if something was lurking within them. One guest ventured out to find the source of the problem, but the staff was nowhere to be found. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone, and the flickering lights cast eerie, shifting patterns on the walls. The guest could swear they saw figures moving in the corners of their vision, but every time they turned to look, there was nothing there. The lights finally steadied, but the unease lingered, a reminder that the darkness was never far away. During a break in the storm, a guest decided to take a walk on the beach, hoping the fresh air would clear their mind. The beach was empty, the sand untouched by any footprints, save for their own. But as they walked, they began to hear the sound of footsteps behind them, though the beach remained deserted. Turning around, they saw only their own tracks, but the sound continued, growing closer. Panic set in as they quickened their pace, but the footsteps matched their speed, relentless and unnerving. Finally, they broke into a run, but the sound followed, only stopping when they reached the safety of the hotel. The beach now seemed less inviting, more like a trap waiting to spring. In the dead of night, one guest awoke to the sound of soft knocking on their door. The clock on the nightstand showed midnight, and the hotel was deathly quiet. Cautiously, they approached the door, but when they looked through the peephole, they saw only darkness. The knocking persisted, growing more insistent, yet when they called out, there was no response. The guest hesitated, unsure whether to open the door, but a chill ran down their spine, warning them to stay put. They backed away, and the knocking suddenly stopped, leaving an unsettling silence. As they lay back down, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing just outside, waiting for them to let it in. The hotel's exterior, once grand, began to show signs of decay as the storm battered it relentlessly. Cracks appeared in the walls, and the roof leaked in several places, leaving dark stains on the ceiling. The guests noticed that the paint seemed to peel faster than it should, revealing old, faded layers beneath. One guest, growing increasingly unnerved, discovered that parts of the hotel's history had been deliberately covered up. All newspapers in the library hinted at a tragic past, with stories of disappearances and unexplained deaths connected to the hotel. The more they dug, the more they realized that the hotel's foundation was as unstable as its history. But as the storm outside intensified, it became clear that something was determined to keep those secrets buried. As the storm reached its peak, the guests decided they couldn't stay another night. But when they tried to leave, they found the exits blocked. The front doors wouldn't budge, as if they had fused with the walls, and the windows showed nothing but impenetrable darkness outside. The hotel, once merely unsettling, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in with every passing minute. The guests searched for another way out, but every corridor led them back to the lobby, where the receptionist stood, smiling that same empty smile. Desperation set in as they realized there was no escape. The hotel had trapped them, and as the final gust of wind rattled the windows, the lights flickered out, leaving them in complete darkness. The hotel stood alone on the desolate beach, its windows dark against the twilight sky. As the guests arrived, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of the sea and something else, something rotten. The hotel's exterior was weathered, its paint peeling, and the sign creaked ominously in the breeze. Inside, the lobby was oddly quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of the old chandelier swaying slightly above. The receptionist greeted the guests with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her voice flat and emotionless. The guests exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, blaming their discomfort on the long journey. As they collected their keys and headed to their rooms, a strange heaviness settled over them, as if the hotel had swallowed their voices and thoughts. The first night at the hotel, the guests noticed something peculiar. The sound of the ocean, so loud when they arrived, had vanished completely. Stepping out onto the balcony, they found the sea still and silent, the waves unmoving, as if frozen in time. The beach, normally alive with the rhythmic crashing of water, was eerily quiet. One guest tried to walk along the shore, but the sand felt different, more like ash than grains of sand. Despite the calm, a sense of unease grew, as if the ocean was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The guests returned to their rooms, unnerved by the unnatural stillness outside. That night, sleep was elusive, and the silence pressed in from all sides, suffocating. One guest, upon reaching their assigned room, found it at the very end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The hallway was lined with identical doors, each one closed, giving the impression that they were the only ones staying on the floor. The door to their room creaked as they opened it, revealing a space that felt colder than the rest of the hotel. The windows were bad, something the guest hadn't noticed in the other rooms, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. A sense of wrongness pervaded the room, as if it had been waiting too long for someone to occupy it. The bed, though neatly made, looked as though it had never been slept in. The guest hesitated before entering, feeling an almost tangible force trying to keep them out. But they dismissed the feeling, stepping inside and closing the door, unaware of the eyes that seemed to follow them. Late that night, a knock sounded at the guest's door, startling them awake. Groggy and disoriented, they answered it to find a bellhop standing in the hallway, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform. The bellhop, who seemed strangely out of place, offered to take their bags, even though they had already unpacked. Confused, the guest declined, but the bellhop insisted, his expression unreadable. When the guest finally refused, the bellhop nodded and walked away, but there was something off about the way he moved, almost like he was floating. The guest shut the door, unnerved, and checked the time, just past midnight. The next morning, when they mentioned the strange encounter at the front desk, the receptionist only smiled and said, "We haven't had a bellhop in years." The following day, the guests noticed that the horizon was no longer visible from the beach. The line where the sky met the sea had blurred, and a dense fog had rolled in, swallowing the distance. As they stood on the shore, they realized that the ocean seemed to stretch out infinitely, with no end in sight. The fog was thick and impenetrable, giving the illusion that the world had simply ceased to exist beyond the beach. One guest, curious and uneasy, decided to walk towards the water, but with each step, the ocean appeared to move further away. No matter how far they walked, they couldn't reach the water's edge. The fog seemed to close in around them, and they eventually turned back, heart pounding, realizing they had no idea how long they had been walking. In their room, one guest discovered a small drawer in the bedside table that wouldn't open no matter how hard they tried. It was locked tight, and there was no key in sight. The guest became obsessed with the drawer, convinced that it held something important, something they needed to see. They tried everything to force it open, but the drawer remained stubbornly shut. As they gave up in frustration, they noticed a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from inside the drawer, like something or someone was trying to get out. The sound grew louder as the night wore on, echoing in the otherwise silent room. But when they touched the drawer again, the tapping stopped abruptly, leaving the guest with an overwhelming sense of dread. On the second night, the guests began to hear strange whispers, faint but persistent, coming from the direction of the ocean. The sound was just below the threshold of understanding. A constant murmur that grew louder as the night deepened. It was as if the sea itself was trying to speak, but the words were lost in translation. Some guests claimed they could hear their names being called, while others swore they heard voices of loved ones long gone. The whispers seemed to seep into the walls of the hotel, filling every corner with an unsettling presence. The guests tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew more insistent, filling their dreams with dark, incomprehensible messages. By morning, the whispers had faded, but the unease remained, a reminder that something was out there waiting. The hotel was filled with old portraits, lining the walls of the corridors and common areas. The guests hadn't paid them much attention at first, but as the days passed, they began to notice something disturbing. The faces in the portraits seemed to change, their expressions subtly shifting when no one was looking. A smile that was once warm became twisted and menacing. Eyes that once gazed calmly now followed the guests as they moved. One guest, feeling unnerved, stood in front of a portrait and stared at it, daring it to move. For a moment, nothing happened, but then they swore they saw the portrait blink. The guest backed away, heart racing, convinced that the painted eyes were watching their every move. From then on, the portraits were impossible to ignore, their silent scrutiny a constant reminder that the hotel was alive in ways the guests couldn't understand. The beach, once a place of relaxation, had become a source of fear. The guests noticed that the sands seemed to move of their own accord, shifting subtly even when there was no wind. Footprints made in the morning would disappear by afternoon, and strange patterns would appear overnight, as if drawn by unseen hands. One guest ventured out at dawn, hoping to catch whatever was causing the changes, but they found the beach deserted, the sand cold and undisturbed. As they walked further, they felt the ground shift beneath them, as though the sand was trying to pull them under. Panic set in, and they quickly returned to the hotel, only to find their footprints already erased, as if they had never been there at all. The beach, once inviting, now felt like a living entity, unpredictable and dangerous. While exploring the hotel, a guest stumbled upon a wing that wasn't on the map they had received at check-in. The corridor leading to it was narrow and dark, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that suggested it hadn't been used in years. The guest hesitated, but curiosity got the better of them, and they ventured further in. The doors in this wing were different, older, with strange symbols carved into the wood. Each room they passed was locked, and an eerie silence filled the air. As they reached the end of the corridor, they found a door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, they discovered a room filled with old, forgotten furniture covered in dust. But what caught their attention was the large, ornate mirror on the far wall. As they approached it, the reflection didn't match the room, showing instead a dark, stormy sea. The guest fled, but when they returned later with others, the wing was gone, as if it had never existed. One guest, after days of feeling increasingly uneasy, decided to leave early. As they packed, they accidentally knocked over the small mirror on the dresser, shattering it into pieces. As they bent down to pick up the shards, they noticed something strange. The reflection in the broken pieces didn't match the room they were in. Instead, the fragments showed images of a different place, a dark, crumbling version of the hotel, with shadowy figures moving through the corridors. One shard showed a figure standing directly behind the guest, but when they spun around, the room was empty. Shaken, they hurried to leave, but every mirror they passed on the way out seemed to show that same dark reflection, following them until they finally made it to the lobby. That night, the guests noticed that the moon, which had been full and bright, was no longer visible. The sky was pitch black, with not a single star to break the darkness. The ocean, too, seemed to reflect this void, the water a deep, inky black with no hint of its usual shimmer. One guest, drawn by the eerie stillness, stepped outside to get a better look, only to find that the beach was gone. Where there had been sand and water, there was now only a vast expanse of darkness, as if the world had ended at the hotel's edge. The guest backed away, heart pounding, but the sense of dread remained, as if something unseen was watching from the void. When they returned inside, the other guests were already talking in hushed tones, wondering what had happened to the night sky. But no one had any answers, only a growing fear that the darkness was closing in. One guest, trying to find their way back to their room, realized that the corridor they were walking down seemed much longer than it had before. The more they walked, the further the end of the hallway seemed to stretch, with the lights flickering and dimming as they went. Panic began to set in as they realized they had been walking for what felt like hours, yet they hadn't reached their door. The corridor, once familiar, now seemed like a labyrinth designed to confuse and trap. They tried turning back, but the way behind them had changed, twisting into another long, shadowy corridor. Their footsteps echoed ominously, and the walls seemed to close in with each step. It wasn't until they finally collapsed in exhaustion that the corridor ended abruptly, with their room door standing before them. But when they opened it, they were greeted by an unfamiliar room, one that felt cold and wrong, as if they had stepped into someone else's nightmare. The storm that had raged since their arrival finally broke on the last day, leaving the air heavy with moisture and tension. The guests, desperate to leave, gathered in the lobby, only to find the receptionist missing and the front doors locked. The once grand lobby now looked different, older, as if the hotel had aged decades overnight. The windows showed nothing but darkness outside, with no sign of the beach or the road they had come in on. Panic set in as they tried to find another way out, but every door led them back to the lobby. The walls began to close in, the ceiling lowering, as if the hotel itself was alive and hungry. One by one, the guests vanished, swallowed by the shadows, until only one remained. As they stood alone in the silent lobby, the lights flickered out, and the last thing they heard was the soft click of a bell, signaling the final checkout.